General Sherman was not inclined to think so, but it was well known that the numerous raids about the country in recent months had been committed by the Fort Sill Reservation Indians, and, after receiving the calls of respect from the officers of the garrison, he gave a delegation of the citizens an opportunity of stating their grievances. All had a most bitter story of cruel wrong and murder to relate, displaying a number of scalps, some of them female, which had been recovered from bands known to be the Kiowas and Comanches from the reservation, and petitioned him for assistance in recovering their stolen stock and punishing these savages. General Sherman was inclined to be very incredulous, and shook his head in such a manner as to cast doubt upon the pleadings of these poor, harassed settlers who had been expecting so much from him. On that very night, the night of deliberation, of doubt and uncertainty, almost of despair, and what was believed by the Jack County ranchers and cattlemen to be an almost hopeless appeal, a wounded man hobbled into our post hospital with a horrible tale of massacre and atrocious butchery on Salt Creek Prairie. His wounds were dressed, and in the morning, General Sherman, who visited him, listened again with almost an air of incredulity to the man's simple story of the bloody struggle. He alone had escaped, and in almost a miraculous manner. The balance, as he thought, had been killed. 12 men, belonging to Henry Warren's corn train of 10 wagons, had been intercepted by a large war party of Indians at a point about 4 miles from Rock Station, on the open prairie near the edge of the timber. There could be nothing more appalling, heartrending, or sickening to the human senses than the spectacle which was witnessed when our command reached the scene of the Salt Creek Prairie Massacre. The poor victims were stripped, scalped, and horribly mutilated. Several were beheaded, and their brains scooped out. Their fingers, toes, and private parts had been cut off and stuck in their mouths, and their bodies, now lying in several inches of water and swollen or bloated beyond all chance of recognition, were filled full of arrows, which made them resemble porcupines. Their bowels had been gashed with knives, and carefully heaped upon each exposed abdomen had been placed a heap of live coals, now, of course, extinguished by the deluge of water which was still coming down with a torrential power almost indescribable. One wretched man, who, fighting hard to the last, had evidently been wounded, was found chained to a wagon wheel, and, a fire having been made from the wagon pole, he had been slowly roasted to death. That he was still alive when the fiendish torture was begun was shown by his limbs being drawn up and contracted. The grain sacks had also all been cut open and contents dumped upon the ground, where it was found, littered and scattered in every direction. Some distance from the wagons, dead mules, piles of corn soaking in the water, harnesses, and other evidences of the fearful struggle were to be seen. Here and there, a hat, an Indian gewgaw, and a plentiful supply of arrows and other debris of the fight were spread about the rain-soaked ground. There were 7 men killed, the names of whom have never been published before and are herewith given: S. Long, N. J. Baxter, Samuel Elliott, James Bowman, James Elliott, James Williams, and John Mullen. 41 mules had been cut loose from the wagons and run off by the retreating Indians. The balance had been killed. It was supposed that this war party of Kiowa was under Satanta, their principal war chief, hearing that General Sherman was coming that way, had planned to intercept and capture him, and then hold him as a hostage for a heavy ransom. Captain Robert Goldthwait Carter.
The little town of Jacksboro, the county seat of Jack County, Texas, was in a fever of excitement over the capture of Satanta. the celebrated war chief of the Kiowas. At the period of which I write, 1871, Satanta was the scourge of the western Texas border. Not content with having committed the bloody massacre at Salt Creek Prairie, he had, after scalping and mutilating his victims and filling their bodies with arrows, lashed one poor teamster to a wagon wheel and burned him while yet alive. A few days later, he rode into Fort Sill at the head of his war party and loudly boasted of his atrocious deed. He was arrested by order of General Sherman, then at the post, double-ironed, and turned over as a prisoner to General McKenzie for trial in Texas for murder. During the march of 123 miles from the Fort Sill reservation, Satanta was closely guarded. At night, pickets were thrown out to prevent surprise, as it was supposed that the Kiowas, upon learning that their chief had been taken to Texas, would follow and attempt a rescue. Herd guards and strong sleeping parties were posted, and every precaution was taken to prevent a stampede. The wily chief was spread out upon the ground, a peg driven at each hand and foot, and he was then bound securely with raw hide. In the Wichita swamps, where the mosquitoes swarm in countless thousands, and to the size of a New Jersey greenhead, the position of the prisoner can be at once pictured, even to the dullest imagination. His grunts, "Ugh-ho," and long-drawn exclamations were heard at all times during the night, notwithstanding prisoner and guards slept in the dense smoke from the green log fires, intended to be a protection from these bloodthirsty tormentors. It was a bright, warm day in June, when the bronzed and weather-stained troopers of the 4th Cavalry rode into Fort Richardson with the prisoner closely guarded by our faithful Tonkawa trailers. The rest of the garrison, with the band, turned out to greet the command. As the column halted, every eye was upon Satanta. His reputation was well known to every man, woman, and child, not only here, but upon the Kansas border. He was over 6 foot in his moccasins, and, mounted upon a small pony, he seemed to be even taller than he really was. He was stark naked, from the crown of his head to the soles of his feet, except that he wore a breech clout and a pair of embroidered moccasins. Owing to the intense heat, he had allowed his blanket to slip down to his saddle and about his loins. His coarse, jet-black hair, now thickly powdered with dust, hung tangled about his neck except a single braided scalp lock, with but one long eagle feather to adorn it. His immense shoulders, broad back, powerful legs and thighs, contrasted singularly with the slight forms of the Tonkawas grouped about him. The muscles stood out on his gigantic frame like knots, and his form, proud and erect in the saddle, his perfectly immovable face and motionless body, gave him the appearance of polished mahogany, or perhaps a bronze equestrian statue sprinkled with dust. Nothing but his intensely black glittering eyes and a slight motion of the lids betokened any life in that carved figure. Every feature of his face spoke the disdain with which he regarded the curious crowd now gathered about headquarters to gaze at the famous savage chief. His feet were lashed with a rawhide lariat under his pony's belly. His hands were tied together and disarmed and helpless. He was indeed a picture of fallen, savage greatness. In accordance with General Sherman's instructions, the day for Satanta's trial for murder arrived. This trial was one of the most impressive yet most ludicrous acts of legal jurisdiction ever witnessed by the hardy settlers and cowboys of Jack County, and is the first instance, I believe, when an Indian chief was regularly indicted and tried for murder by a legally drawn jury under a civil process. The town was swarming with men, all intent upon seeing justice done. Under a strong guard, and accompanied by the Fort Sill interpreter and the counsel who had been assigned, the blanketed chief with clanking chain walked to the little log courthouse in the square of Jacksboro. A jury had been impaneled. The district attorney bustled and flourished around. Though whole county, every man armed to the teeth tried to crowd in. It was impossible, so they surrounded the courthouse and listened breathlessly through the open windows. Two long, dingy wooden benches, well whittled and worn, held the jurors, who nervously hitched about in their seats and uneasily regarded the extreme novelty of their situation. Inside the railing sat the stolid chief, closely wrapped. The counsel for the defense opened and in a spread-eagle speech referred to the numerous wrongs that the noble red man, my brother, had suffered, wherein he had been cheated and despoiled of his lands, driven westward, until it seemed as though there was no limit to the greed of this white brother. If he had been guilty of acts of violence toward the aggressive race which was driving him out, that was but the excusable retaliation which merely human instinct, nay, even the instinct of the worm that turns, required of him. Warming up to his task, he now threw off his coat, as it was an intensely hot day, and discoursed about the times of the Aztecs, Cortez, and the Montezumas, and pictured Guatanayozin lying calmly upon a bed of coals as upon a bed of roses. Here he displayed considerable historical lore. But when he spoke of the majestic bird, that emblem of our national freedom, and urged that the great chief be allowed to fly away as free and unhampered, I turned quickly to watch the jury. Every cowboy had been industriously whittling the old bench and squirting tobacco juice at a crack. But the words of the counsel having been interpreted to the chief, whose frequent grunts of approval and delight at what he supposed meant immediate release now sounded loudly over the courtroom, I noted an immediate change. The jury were all in shirt sleeves. Each had his old shooting iron strapped to his hip. They all hitched their weapons to the front, immediately ceased reducing with their sheath knives the proportions of the jury bench, and now intently waited for further developments and more oratory. The district attorney was really quite an able little fellow, and he grew eloquent over the enormity of the chief's crime as he rapidly painted the cold-blooded massacre and the cruel murder of the poor teamsters upon Salt Creek Prairie. As he pictured the scene, the bloody chief's victims lying cold and stark, the charred remains of one who had been slowly roasted alive chained to the wheel. Every brow grew black. Every juryman settled himself in his seat, gave an extra hitch to the gun on his belt, and we saw the verdict plainly written upon their faces, from the foreman to the very last man. The afterpiece of the other counsel for defense had no effect. He took off his coat, vest, collar, and necktie, rolled up his shirt sleeves, and advancing up to the foreman, an old gray-headed frontiersman, shook his fingers at him and gesticulated in the most violent manner. It was of no avail. The doom of the noble red man was sealed. The jury was briefly charged. It retired to a corner of the same room. A few minutes of hurried conversation and angry head-shaking, and they were back again in their seats. Have the jury agreed upon a verdict? We have. What say you, Mr. Foreman? Is this Indian chief, Satanta, guilty or not guilty of murder? With a most startling emphasis, the grisly old foreman shouted, "He is. We figure him guilty." Satanta was sentenced to be hanged, but the pressure from Washington was so great upon Governor Davis of Texas that he was compelled to commute his sentence to imprisonment for life. We held him a prisoner at the fort until the following October, when he was transferred to the state penitentiary at Huntsville, where a few years later he ended his life by throwing himself headlong from an upper gallery of the prison upon the pavement below.